I'm all set to blow your mind with the story of an African slave. A slave with unprecedented mathematical abilities. I'm talking about Thomas Fuller, also known as Negro Tom, the Virginia calculator. He was an enslaved African renowned for his mathematical abilities, who could not even read or write. In most discussions of people with extraordinary powers of mental calculation, there is some mention of Thomas Fuller. But I have a problem with this. To me, this man doesn't seem to be celebrated enough. Just unlike other mathematical geniuses in the world, today I'm making this video to celebrate Thomas Fuller. So much of what is known about Fuller's life comes from two sources, okay? The first one, a report on his mathematical abilities prepared by Dr. Benjamin Rush and published in the American Museum or the Universal Magazine in 1788. And the second one being his obituary, which appeared in the Boston newspaper Columbian Continental on December 29, 1790. According to this obituary, he was 80 years when he passed away, which places his birthday around 1710. The article described Fuller as very black, and he was brought to the US at the age of 14 and sold as a slave along with many of his unlucky countrymen. But his brilliance was used as a proof that enslaved blacks were more intelligent than whites, which fueled some pro-abolitionist discussion. Born in Africa somewhere between present-day Liberia and Benin, Fuller was shipped to America in 1724. At the age of 14, he was brought to Alexandria, then a small town, Virginia, and sold into a lifetime slavery. And he was owned by Priestley and Elizabeth Cox, a childless couple who had over 232-acre farmland just 4 miles from Alexandria. But you wouldn't believe Fuller worked his entire life as a field hand there. Though he could never read or write, he had perfectly acquired the skill of enumeration. His learning consisted of numbers, riddles, mathematical games. Very early in his adult life, Fuller taught himself calculation, first counting to 10, then 1 to 100, but he was a slave in the farmland. And in his limited world, he thought to himself that he would use his new discovery and began it by investigating a cow's tail. He counted the hairs on the tail exactly 2,872, as he recalled years later. He then amused himself by counting a bushel of wheat and a bushel of flax seed, grain by grain. He developed a new technique of multiplication for number of poles, yards, feet, inches, for any given distance, including the diameter of Earth's orbit. That means he could calculate many feet or inches there in even Earth's orbit. Mr. Rush reports at length on the particulars of Fuller's calculations. So when Fuller was at his later age, 60s or just 70s, two white men, Hertshon and Coates, both Quakers from Pennsylvania, traveled to Cox's farm and posed several hard problems for him to solve. And to their utter shock, their boastful curiosity was shattered by the impeccable answer of Fuller. The first question they asked, how many seconds are there in a year and a half? He answered 47,304,000, and it was a correct answer, that too without using pen and paper or anything else, just with his extraordinary brain power. But the answer being correct isn't enough here. You know the time he took to calculate this humongous calculation? Less than 120 seconds. Yeah, less than 120 seconds. Can you do that? I can't do that in my wildest imagination. But the Quakers didn't stop there. They went on to ask the second question, and that is more dramatic. They asked how many seconds a man has lived who is 70 years, 17 days, and 12 hours old. He answered in just 90 seconds. 2,210,580. So one of the gentlemen was also doing this calculation on paper to take Fuller's answer. After a while, he told that Fuller's answer was all wrong. And everyone present there was about to look at Fuller with their crooked eyes, but within a split second, Fuller, the old man, hastily replied, "Stop, master, you forget the leap year." On adding the amount of the seconds of the leap years, the amount of the whole in both their sums agreed exactly, and that's the genius of Fuller. A slave, world's most brilliant slave. After several correct answers later, the two gentlemen came to believe that Fuller's abilities must have once been greater when he was young. They wrote he was gray-headed and exhibited several other marks of the weakness and old age at the time of their meeting. So one of the gentlemen, Mr. Coates, remarked in his presence that it was a pity he did not have an education equal to his genius. You know what he replied? "No, master. It is best I had no learning, for many learned men be great fools." He meant many educated people were great fools, which we see all the time around us. Mrs. Cox, herself illiterate, realized that Tom the slave possessed a talent which ought to be put to practical use, and she eventually employed him in all aspects of the plantation life in her farmland. Yeah. And how many shingles for the new roof? How many poles and rails to enclose the meadow? How much corn to seed a designated field? The answers were immediate, and all is correct. The Coxes enslaved 16 people and always valued Fuller the most, for obvious reasons, right? So as the years passed, rumors about the remarkable slave moved throughout the countryside, and the Coxes were lured with huge money to sell Fuller. They always declined these offers of large sums of money from several people, and later Tom Fuller actually acknowledged his gratitude for their refusal to sell him. Fauvel and Paula wrote, Thomas Fuller was an African shipped to America as a slave in 1724. Late in his life, his remarkable power of calculation was discovered by anti-slavery campaigners who used him as a demonstration that blacks are not mentally inferior to whites. His story was often related to the context of anti-slavery literature, which sought to demonstrate the mental fitness of African Americans. So in 1970, Negro Tom, the famous African calculator, died at the age of 80, having never learned to read or write. In spite of his extraordinary power of calculation, Tom Fuller's epitaph came out of Boston, and this elegy was included. Thus died Negro Tom, the self-taught arithmetic. This untutored scholar. Had his opportunities of improvement been equal to those of thousands of his fellow men, neither the Royal Society of London, the Academy of Science at Paris, nor even Newton himself would have been ashamed to acknowledge him as a brother in science. Take care. Goodbye.